Wonderful to see you again.
Wonderful to see you as well. A little more each time, it seems. So my name is Keith Martin Smith, and I'm a Zen priest and an author and a martial arts lineage holder. And you are Doshin Roshi, friend and a teacher, and a bit of a troublemaker who has gotten into a little more trouble recently. So why don't we start just with you talking about what's alive for you right now?
Trouble is alive for me right now. I'm actually tired of pussyfooting around.
Great.
And I'm not as sophisticated as you are. So I really appreciate you coming in to kind of calm me down.
Now you're just trying to flatter me so I play nice.
No, I don't want you to play nice. Quite the contrary. I want to challenge you. I want to bring the martial art out in you. Let's bring the samurai out. This is Samurai Zen, remember?
Right. So let's get into it. So you have an interesting relationship to things like safety and around playing it safe. And we seem to be in a culture that really is encouraging that right now. A lot of safety, a lot of let's protect our feelings. And that's not your way.
It's not my way. And in fact, just speaking very personally and very candidly, I'm an 8 on the Enneagram.
Which is what?
I'm a challenger. Some would call it the boss. Some would call it the asshole. It's actually the antithesis of what the ideal type person would be in what I would call the more liberal cultural view. You know, Trump is an 8. So he triggers people a little bit. 8s just naturally being themselves will trigger people that have a liberal leaning to their beliefs and values. Mm-hmm. So I find that I can't be myself. And it upsets me a little bit. It's inconvenient. So that leads to all sorts of trouble that I create.
Well, but it's interesting because here we are in this postmodern era, and I've certainly felt this in my own life as an author and as a martial artist and as a Zen practitioner, that my relationship to safety, when I play it safe, things don't really happen.
Yes.
If I get on the cushion and I want to be in a safe container, then I wouldn't go to a Zen retreat where you have to get up at 5 in the morning, or 4 in the morning, excuse me, you have to be in a cushion at 5 in the morning. If I wanted to play it safe, I wouldn't have gone into an embodiment practice that emphasizes actual physical conflict, actual fighting. And writing books is incredibly vulnerable and difficult and exposes you in a way that can be very uncomfortable. So my relationship to safety has always been to move away from it because the juice is there. Yet we seem to be at a time culturally when people are being encouraged to really be safe. And so how do you deal with that as a teacher and as a human in your own practice?
Isn't that a great question? With great difficulty I deal with this. Because the truth is that we have to be pushed. We have to be pushed to our limits. There's an idea that a gentleman by the name of Nassim Taleb came out with called Anti-Fragility. Now, this is one of those rare new ideas that he articulated some old wisdom, some grandmother-type wisdom, in a new way that's just incredible. So, no pain, no gain is a way of looking at this. This is kind of an idiom that we say, oh, well, that's right. If I want to become a martial artist, I'm going to have to push myself beyond the point of pain. As a Zen master, if I want to wake up, I'm going to have to submit myself to rigorous sitting that pushes beyond the threshold of pain.
And be in a hierarchy as well.
Exactly.
Which isn't always pleasant.
Well, it is for an 8, especially if I'm on top of the hierarchy. So this is the traditional way that this has been done for thousands of years, this practice of awakening. Now, in this age, that doesn't work. It violates some boundaries, some very specific rules. But there's nothing to replace it that does work. That's a real problem that every spiritual teacher is struggling with.
Okay, so this is really important, and I certainly have seen it with some of the organizations that been working with outside of Zen, that there's something about a deep spiritual practice that involves a relationship to a lack of safety. Yet you also, in your Sangha, you have a really beautiful relationship to safety. So you're not advocating that we be unsafe necessarily. It's
Yes.
done very skillfully.
Yes.
And so how do you walk that line between a depth of practice that gets you beyond ego and something that allows you to be safe enough to do the work that I know that you advocate that we need to do?
Now, this is a much deeper question, and it's a very important question. There is post-traumatic stress syndrome. You have to be very careful not to traumatize somebody or activate trauma that's already there so that they become overwhelmed and totally shut down. But there's also something that is not well known that's post-traumatic growth syndrome, where you actually break through. So this is actually dialectical. You know Hegel's thesis, antithesis, new thesis, breakdown.
Or break down or break through.
Breakdown or breakthrough.
And that's a very controversial, I know that idea, there is evidence for it in trauma work, that some people experience trauma and they explode into a new level of growth. Yes. But it's very controversial because people feel it shames the people that don't.
So it's only controversial at a certain altitude of consciousness. Mm-hmm. The postmodern liberals, if we want to really articulate their ideology, I would say that it's postmodern egalitarian relativism. It's a set of beliefs and values that is really an ideology that has a certain set of beliefs and values that we could identify that is very popular, especially in America. I find it quite different in Europe. Mm-hmm. So everyone has to be equal, even if they're not. We have to pretend that they are. Everybody has to be safe. Everybody can only have positive emotions. We cannot allow any aggression, any anger. And
sounds like kindergarten.
Well, it is kindergarten from my perspective. That's about how much gets done.
Right.
This is, I love a beautiful Buddhist teacher by the name of Stephen Levine, who has passed away, did a lot of death and dying work. And he said it so clearly. He worked with a lot of prisoners on death row that knew the exact moment they were going to die. And he sat with them, he worked with them. And he found that even these prisoners didn't believe they were going to die. They imagined that they would come back after the execution and tell their cellmates what it was like to die. That's just the way the mind works. What he said was safety is the most unsafe spiritual path you can take. It leaves you frozen in fear, unable to take risks, unable to try anything new, unable to learn from your mistakes. It is a horrible strategy for spiritual growth or for human growth. It just doesn't work. And yet a degree of fundamental safety is crucial. This is the first milestone in attachment theory. If you don't have safety as a newborn infant, you're not going to get anything. In fact, you're very likely to develop a psychosis if that safety is interrupted radically and never stabilized. Your growth is stuck at right at that developmental level. So safety is crucial. And yet, as we're not infants anymore, it becomes problematic.
So what you're saying is, as in your work as a Zen teacher, that you're tracking that you don't want to re-traumatize people, that there's an awareness that there can be traumas, kleshas that can exist, stuck points, and that you and your senior students and people that are doing this work are trained to recognize when there might be a trauma and not to poke it unskillfully.
Yes. So
And in there's a relationship to safety.
Yes.
In the context of growth.
Yes. So This is such an important topic. Let's go slow.
Great.
And let's make it a dialogue.
Great.
What I've found personally, since I'm an 8 on the Enneagram, and when I learn the most is when I'm challenged the hardest. You want to get my attention? Kick me in the head. You've got my attention. Now I'm ready to learn. I learned that in the martial arts, as you've learned it. It's how you learn to follow the rules and develop respect for others, respect for yourself, discipline, and devoted practice. These are the traditional values that most people today didn't have an opportunity to learn. And I wouldn't have either had I not become a black belt in the martial arts. You know, you've surpassed my studies in the martial arts. But these are the qualities that you have embodied and manifest every day. Most people don't have these qualities.
Right.
So when I'm working with people, it was really hard for me to learn that everybody doesn't learn like I do. You can't kick everybody in the head. But I finally have learned that. I've learned that when someone is stubbornly resisting a lie they're telling themselves, that's a time to challenge them with great intensity. But when all of a sudden I watch the light go out of their eyes as though they've crawled back into a cave to be safe, that I must completely back off energetically. And I must make great room and treat them with tender care so that they don't have to run away.
So they don't have to care for themselves.
Well, they don't have to be overwhelmed and really disappear. They're not traumatized
So
or re-traumatized.
dissociating, in other words, some form
Exactly.
of... Right.
A form of dissociation.
Right.
And this has been very difficult for me to learn as a teacher. It goes against the way that I personally learn. And there aren't very many people that learn like I do. I would say you probably don't, although you've learned similar lessons, but I'll bet your learning style was very different. Much more intelligent.
Well, we'll see.
Or sophisticated. Mine was pretty simple.
Right.
Yeah. So this is so important, how to challenge people just enough that they'll go through that dialectical breakthrough. Great. And challenge them not so much that they'll go through the dialectical breakdown.
And the problem then I'm hearing you identify is that with postmodern spirituality, with an emphasis on safety, is that it encourages neither. Sounds like people just sort of stay where they are.
They stay stuck.
And they get to feel good, they think, about what's going on.
They pretend to feel good.
Right.
It becomes all about feeling good.
Right.
So it just breaks my heart.
As opposed to
growing and awakening and becoming real. It's being nice at the expense of being real has become what to do. Right. And it's tragic. The
being
consequences are tragic.
Being nice at the expense of being real.
Yes.
Yeah. Another way would be to say that would be being nice instead of speaking the truth.
Well, that's part of being real, speaking the truth.
Right.
And it's ironic because right now women want to find their voice and speak their truth. I'm all for that. My God, their voice has been throttled for 10,000 years. I encourage every woman that I see trying to speak her truth to speak her truth. I make room for that. And I'm very conscious that it's so easy to traumatize or re-traumatize them that I give them room to speak. But I notice that culturally what's happening, there's one thing happening for the individual who's finding her voice. There's another thing that's happening for the culture that's suppressing male voices. And that is also tragic.
Sort of the becoming the thing that they hate the most.
Yes. So the cultural collective rules are to keep order. the individual breaks those rules, causes trouble, that's what creativity is. How do we create new culture? We break the existing rules.
And there's an emergence, a novel emergence.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That is duplicated because it
Right.
works. So we find culture and individuality in direct opposition to each other.
Right, right. And the culture that we're in now is, would you say it's particularly challenging as a spiritual teacher, the way people are enculturated now as they come to you and what they have as opposed to, say, 20 years ago or 30 years ago?
It is hopelessly ineffective as a spiritual path. Hopelessly ineffective.
Because of the identification with safety, with equality.
With safety, with equality, with entitlement.
Uh-huh.
Entitled to not get something without having to have any skin in the game and earn it, without needing to take responsibility for anything.
Aha.
Aha.
Aha. Responsibility.
Yes.
So responsibility. So if we get into something, a woman comes to you, you spoke about 10,000 years of oppression.
Yes.
And this cultural phenomena that's happening.
Yes.
And so a woman comes to you and she speaks about all of the ways that she's struggled in her life for empowerment and where she's coming into it now. Mm-hmm. What's the relationship to responsibility in something like that?
Oh. We must take responsibility for the impact our energy is having.
On?
Everything. Each other. This belief that I'm here and you're there, which we're taught at infancy, is a delusion. Someone who awakens and realizes the deepest truth of who we are, realizes that this sense of self is just a persistent delusion that keeps arising, and I believe it. It's just simply not true. And it is the cause of endless suffering in my life, in your life, in the world. So taking responsibility for the impact everything, the whole of everything that I'm doing is having on others is a sign of maturity. And if I'm so concerned about being safe and being equal and being entitled and feeling good, I'm totally abdicating my responsibility.
So when you're working with someone, then you're acknowledging that there might be both systemic and personal, not only trauma, but also oppression happening. And one of the ways that you're offering a solution, if you will, is by showing that the self isn't real.
Of course, it's called Buddhism.
And I've heard that. And that there's this radical responsibility piece that
Yes.
doesn't negate those other truths.
It doesn't negate anything.
Right.
It actually enhances everything.
So that sounds pretty complex.
It's so simple. Radical responsibility. Uh-huh. It's terrifying to someone who identifies with being a victim or identifies with being a rescuer. So if I identify with rescuing victims,
which there's a lot of in our culture, of course.
yeah. It's pretty prominent today, isn't it?
Yeah.
And now, being an aide, I actually identify with being a perpetrator, a troublemaker. So, of course, I'm singled out and attacked ruthlessly, which is okay. If it doesn't kill me, it makes me stronger. But, what I've had to find in order to have the wisdom to know whether to make room for someone or to challenge them with intensity, what I've had to find is my own internal perpetrator and my own internal victim, places where I really have been victimized. And I had to dig really deep to find those. And I did find them. I did find them. And that enables me to have the degree of sensitivity that I can see the places that other people are falling into that victim overwhelm, and they're disappearing. And once I have the emotional sensitivity to recognize that, then I can help them. If I don't, I not only don't have the sensitivity to recognize when they've disappeared, so I keep pushing, I don't have the wisdom to help them. So this is me taking responsibility for my own victim, my own perpetrator, my own rescuer.
And so as we own those archetypes within ourselves, because so what you're saying is that if someone comes to you and they have a legitimate victim story, it's not that the story isn't real, it's that the story is much deeper than it appears to be.
Oh, yes. And it needs to be heard. When someone has a victim story that's activated, the archetype of the victim is activated. They're actually a sacrificial lamb. That truth needs to be spoken. They're carrying a tremendous amount of shame. Their volition and their agency, their ability to set boundaries and get angry and take a stand have been violated, and they have been victimized, and they've given up the power. This creates an incredible amount of shame because that anger can't get out and it needs to go somewhere. Where does it go?
In.
It goes in.
Internalized.
And it becomes self-loathing.
Right.
Violence towards self.
Right, and that's the idea of internalized oppression, in part.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a fancy way of saying it.
Yeah.
It really is me beating myself up unreasonably. And it's often kind of a preemptive strike to, if I beat myself up, then you don't have to beat me up. Right. And it keeps me in victim mode. And other people trying to rescue me just enhance that victim mode. They no longer can fulfill the identification with being a rescuer if I stop being a victim. So rather than teaching me how to take responsibility and learning affect regulation, learning to control my setting boundaries without getting angry, taking responsibility for the boundaries I need to set, I will remain in victim rather than taking responsibility.
And so, in other words, the way I hear that is saying that you'll be dependent on that rescuer rather than dependent on yourself.
Co-enabled.
Right. So it's a codependency.
It's a codependency.
Right. And that's happening, it seems, writ large
Everywhere.
in our culture, especially universities and places where they're really coddling
Yes.
a victim in the sense of keeping them in the victim place.
Yeah.
Because I feel good if I get to rescue you. That's
exactly.
the other part. Right?
That's the payoff.
Right. Right.
I can be the hero.
I get to be virtuous and self-righteous and moral.
And pretend that I'm not perpetrating
Right.
your victimhood.
Right.
Which I am.
So in spiritual practice, in Zen in particular, but in any spiritual discipline at all, the primacy of container is huge. That we have a strong container that can hold us as practitioners.
Yes.
In an organization that's more towards the postmodern egalitarian mindset, the container, the emphasis is going to be obviously on safety, and that people feel good. So those would be the sort of two things that the container would try to emphasize, or that it would try to protect maybe the most.
Those are the worst things
So
to do.
in the containers that you create, what do you strive for and
Yes. You've known me for a long time.
why? I have.
You've seen me struggle with this.
I have. I've seen some containers that weren't so good.
Some that you didn't trust. There were many that I didn't trust. That we were learning to fly this airplane as we were building it, as we were flying. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't.
There were a few crashes.
There
is for
were
sure.
many crashes. There were many crashes, and we learned a lot. And I don't know any other way to learn these critical lessons than trial and error. When the history books are written, it sounds so pretty, it sounds so organized, when the truth is always, we just fucking tried and failed until we figured it out.
Yeah, it's a big mess.
It's a big mess. It's always messy. That's the story of my life. How about yours? So let's be honest about this. So, as you are aware of, I had some deep work that I had to do in order to be an effective teacher. And I looked around and I couldn't find any place that I could do this work in. There were no containers that were strong enough for me to do the deep work that I needed to do in order to fulfill my vows as a priest, to benefit all beings, let alone a Roshi. Oh my God, that's taking it up a level. Just wait.
Don't threaten me.
Run. What a shitty job. So, in lieu of there being no place I could do this deep work, I had to create a space to do this work. And it was very messy. And I learned tons of lessons. I learned that it's transcend and include. This is an idea, Hegel said negate and preserve. Wilber says transcend and include. They're both part of the same process. Negate and preserve, when I actually make it to a higher level of consciousness, I have to negate the lower level of consciousness in order to solidify the higher level of consciousness. And that can be viewed in a positive way as transcend, and then the older level of consciousness is included in the newer level of consciousness. In a very practical thing, I found that in order to create a strong enough container to do the depth of work that I needed to do, I had to transcend, I had to go beyond the postmodern, egalitarian, relativistic belief system that dictated that we all had to be nice, all those values. You have to be safe, you have to be nice, you can't hurt anybody's feelings.
And you were there at one point in your life. So
Well,
it's
of course,
not like
I
you're not
spent
sympathetic
30 years
right,
there.
Right. So you see this, you transcend it,
Yes.
you negate it.
But I had to exclude those values. The people didn't matter, but I had to exclude that value system because it automatically weakened the container so that we couldn't do the deeper work that is guaranteed to make you really fucking uncomfortable. Both growing up and shadow work.
Growing up and shadow work.
And waking up.
Uh-huh.
Yes. So once I excluded those rules, we had to make up new rules. Like, it's more important that we be real than we be nice. Instead of being safe, we're open, honest, and vulnerable. And real.
And then some relationship to trauma.
Yes. So what I quickly learned is that even though I told people we were going to do deep shadow work, and people said, yeah, I want to do that, they really didn't want to do that. They wanted to feel good. They thought shadow work would make them feel good, and they were shocked when they had to be uncomfortable to do shadow work, so they left right away. Pretty soon it was self-selecting. All I had to do was say, are you really willing to be totally uncomfortable and radically honest with all of us? Well, maybe not. That's what it takes to create a strong enough container to do the deeper work. And when you get down to the deepest work, it has to do with safety. And this is where you need discernment as a leader of such a group to discern where people are in the process of being overwhelmed because they're not safe, which is really triggering deep attachment, insecure attachment issues. This is where Daniel Brown's attachment theory and his textbook come in. It's just so important. You can go right down the list. Secure attachment means that the milestone of safety gets a checkbox. Were you safe when you were an infant?
No.
I wasn't either. No checkbox. Problem. That will come out later in every relationship we have, yes?
Yeah, absolutely.
The next thing is attunement. So attunement is where your mother was so in tune with you as an infant that she knew what you needed before you needed it. You didn't even have to cry. She was right there. You didn't even have to cry if you were hungry. She fed you. You know, this is attunement. This is only found in First Nation cultures where they're simple and they can completely devote themselves to the children. There's no complications of civilization. My mother wasn't always in tune with what I needed. Was yours?
Not at all.
No checkbox.
Yep.
The third one is delight. You know, when a child is learning, a newborn infant is learning 10 billion things a day. And every time they learn, they react just like you and I do when we learn something new. Delight shines in their eyes, and their mother is right there to reflect it back to them. Encourage the learning. Encourage the delight. If that's not reflected back, the light goes out, and they're not secure. They're not safe. It's not safe to learn anything new, so they get guarded. So did you always get delight reflected back to you?
Not so much.
I didn't either. Again, you and I aren't doing so good in this checklist.
It's the reason I'm a martial artist.
Me too. I needed safety.
Right.
I had to be strong enough to be safe.
Right.
You too.
Yeah.
Yeah, duh. What a gift that was.
Yeah.
Huh? That was an example of post-traumatic growth syndrome.
Uh-huh.
We grew because we weren't safe. We didn't get those check boxes checked. But, you know, we've really had to do cleanup in our relationships, I suspect.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I know a little bit of your past. You know a little bit of my past. We've been busy doing cleanup.
That's right.
That relationship with the parents is relived in every relationship that we have. And this is where Hal Stone and his voice dialogue, you know, says that these parental bonding patterns, which are really another way of talking about transference and countertransference, which is just another way of talking about shadow projection, those parental bonding patterns become the pattern that we relive in every relationship we ever have. And we can work that all the way down to this level of making room for where your boundaries were violated as a child or an infant. But man, we have to do our own work to be able to do this. This is crucial. This is part of that strong container. So what we've ended up with is not only do we need a strong container in integral Zen, we need an integrally informed Roshi, or lineage holder. Right now we only have one. We're looking for a replacement. I'm about ready to retire. There's no retirement. Don't get that idea. And we need practices. We need practices that are practical and really work. And we have tons of practices we developed in that laboratory that you didn't trust to enter because it wasn't quite trustworthy. We were experimenting. Guilty, it's true. But we did experiment, and we did come up with some incredible practices. You ought to come back and visit with us. And the fourth thing that we need is something that I am not very good at. It's a nurturing community. And this is where the postmodern egalitarian relativism, people that are attracted to those beliefs and values, happen to be really good at building nurturing communities. So this is where we let them back in to help us, because they're good at it. So a lineage holder that's integrally informed, that can see the problems that other people can't see without being able to see the evolutionary nature of consciousness, which a structural way, not just an awakening way. So an integrally informed lineage holder, a strong container, practices that work, and a nurturing community. These four ingredients are critical.